For reasons I've not been able to establish, the eldest of the Brazel boys, George Priest Brazel, Priest with his mother's maiden name, that's George Priest Brazel. He's wearing a funny old shirt, but he used to wear that over his swimming trunks. So he emigrated to Canada on the 25th of June 1914 aboard the Empress of Britain. She sailed from Liverpool bound for Quebec, and George was born in Chesham in 1895, which made him 19 years of age when he left Amersham. His occupation on the passenger list stated he was a butcher. This is obviously the trade he'd been taught at 52 High Street in Amersham. Now, it seemed very odd to me that George emigrated only weeks before the outbreak of war, but realised now, of course, that no one had the slightest clue that the shooting in Sarajevo would lead to a world war, apart perhaps from the British government, and then only a few of them. George turned out to be the driving force behind the sausage and pie business, which at its peak employed 800 people, 350 of those were in Amersham. So when I researched further, it came as no surprise to find that the Rothschild emigration scheme could have funded George's journey to better himself. Many large landowners helped young men to emigrate overseas for this very purpose. I've not been able to pinpoint where he first lived, but by the 11th of February 1915, he certainly was in Calgary, Alberta, as that is where he enlisted. His attestation papers got his age wrong, or George did, no doubt because he was too young to enlist in Canada. This was not an unusual occurrence. This happened to the wonderful Amersham character Jim Gilbert, as is recounted in his interview by the Imperial War Museum. He was 17 at the outbreak of war and travelled to London with two of his mates to sign up at, of all places, Marylebone Ladies' Swimming Baths. Upon being asked his age by the recruiting officer, he said, 17, sir. And the officer replied, if you go outside and come back again and say you're 19, it won't be anything to do with me then, will it? Jim did just that and was recruited on the spot to serve with the Royal Horse Artillery in France and Salonika. Right, we go back to George. According to his attestation papers, he was 5'6.5" tall, with brown eyes and dark hair. In answer to the question about distinctive marks and marks indicating congenital peculiarities or previous disease, he had a scar on left leg and right knee, mole on neck. Hardly congenital peculiarities. He was assigned to the 50th Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. The entire battalion, 1,036 men and 41 officers, left Halifax, Canada, on board the SS Orduna, arriving in Liverpool in October 1915. From here, the battalion were transported by train to Bramshott Training Camp near Liphook in Hampshire. They were there for a year, and during this time he had occasional leave and visited his family back here in Amersham. His mother Annie said he looked very fine and handsome in his uniform. On one of these occasions he contracted pneumonia and lay very ill on the couch downstairs, so his mother called in Dr. Gardner, who was overheard by his brother John Brazel saying, I'm sorry, Mrs. Brazel, there's nothing more I can do. She cried and she cried. Providentially, there was a Canadian hospital in Taplow who sent an ambulance to collect him, which caused quite a stir in the high street, with the neighbours looking on with rather over-dramatic looks on their faces. Thankfully, George recovered and returned to his training camp in Hampshire. But what was he to face from there on? After his arrival in Le Havre on the 11th of August 1916, his battalion, and remember there were 1,077 of them, made their way by various forms of transport to join the 4th Canadian Division in the First Battle of the Somme, which had begun on the 1st of July 1916. The distance between Le Havre and the Somme is approximately 114 miles, and today would take 3 hours by car. Well, in 1916, it took approximately 65 days. Hardly surprising when you think of what equipment the needs of a battalion were. 56 horses, 6 ammunition carts, 3 water carts, 3 general service wagons for machine guns, medical supplies and wagons, any number of wagons or lorries for general supplies and goodness knows what else. During those 65 days, there were numerous stops before arriving at the Somme. And on one of these moves, there were 44 store wagons, as well as all the equipment I've just mentioned. On one page of the war diaries, and there were thousands of pages, of the 50th Division was headed, "List of stores to be left behind in the event of a move." That list included loud-sounding instruments, boots gum thigh, boots gum short, gongs and apparatus for warning gas attacks, wire, barbed and plain, latrine buckets and so on. In all, some thousands of items. What a logistical nightmare. Well, that's where George Brazel came in handy. He had been promoted to Staff Quartermaster Sergeant in charge of 250 men in respect of their requirements as to arms, equipment, clothing, necessaries, whatever they were, and making sure all articles were properly marked previous to issue. Perhaps use Cash's name tag. In addition, he oversaw accommodation, issue of bedding and writing paper for the men in hospital. A rather grisly task was, prior to a court inquiry on a deserter, he will obtain the official names and prices of all articles deficient. If that was not enough, he will keep the pay and mess roll and otherwise carry out the duties of company accountant and be responsible for the cleanliness of cookhouses and latrines, but only in the vicinity of his company of 250, you'll be pleased to know. His battalion went on to serve with huge distinction and courage at the battles of Vimy Ridge, Lens, Passchendaele, Ypres, and many, many more. Whilst George was never a frontline soldier, he played his vital part by supporting the men who were. This was not his choice, but by command. And I've discovered in my researches that my Uncle George was mentioned in dispatches and awarded the Meritorious Service Medal. Both are awards for gallantry, but as luck would have it, the Canadian records, which give me full details, are currently unavailable. However, the definition of the Meritorious Service Medal is
granted in respect of gallant conduct in the performance of military duty otherwise than in action against the enemy, or in saving or attempting to save the life of an officer or soldier, or devotion to duty in a theatre of war.
Mentioned in dispatches is defined as
a soldier mentioned in dispatches is one whose name appears in an official report written by a superior officer and sent to the high command, in which is described the soldier's gallant or meritorious action in the face of the enemy.
Not bad for a son of a butcher who left school at 14. The 50th Battalion stayed and fought in France until the Germans agreed to an armistice on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918.